Sean Diddy Combs was once untouchable, an icon of wealth, power, and fame. But when he was thrown into the cold, unforgiving walls of the Metropolitan Detention Center, all of that was stripped away. What I witnessed there wasn't the fall of a celebrity. It was something darker. Alone in his cell, Diddy wasn't just haunted by his past or the weight of his crimes. There was something else, something waiting for him in the shadows. The things Diddy told me about his sins and the horrors tied to his fame forever shattered my spirit. This isn't just Diddy's story, it's mine too. This is Diddy's King. The Metropolitan Detention Center, MDC, isn't just a place, it's a presence, a weight that settles over anyone who steps inside. The walls feel too close, the air too heavy, and there's a silence that's never really silent. Only the hum of fluorescence, the occasional bark of an officer, and the far-off echoes of inmates shouting through steel doors. I've worked here for years. You'd think I'd be numb to it by now. I thought I was. But MDC has a way of breaking people, both inmates and staff. It grinds you down in ways you don't realize until the nightmares start. Most of us don't talk about those, but we all have them. Still, I had my routines, my walls. Nothing surprised me anymore, or so I thought. But everything changed the day he arrived. Sean Diddy Combs walked through the gates like a man already sentenced to death. He didn't look like the untouchable mogul I remembered from the headlines, the music videos, or the red carpets. That man was larger than life, with a smile so sharp it could cut glass. This man was a husk. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow and darting to every shadow like he expected one of them to swallow him whole. He muttered to himself as they led him through processing. I couldn't make out the words, but his tone was low and frantic, like a man praying to someone who stopped listening. The officers escorting him didn't care. To them, he was just another inmate. They laughed about the press frenzy outside, joking that Diddy probably missed his private jets and mansion parties. I stayed back, watching from the edge of the hallway. Something about him gave me a bad vibe. It wasn't just the way he looked, though that was unsettling enough. It was the energy he carried, the weight of it. MDC always felt heavy, but when Diddy walked in, it was suffocating. Before they even let him into the main block, I was called into the warden's office. That was unusual. I didn't usually meet inmates until they were already inside. The warden didn't waste time on pleasantries. He slid a folder across the desk, his expression grim. "You're going to have to sign this." I opened the folder and froze. It was a non-disclosure agreement. "What's this for?" I asked. My voice came out sharper than I intended. "This is a high-profile case," he said, leaning back in his chair. "We don't want anything leaking to the press. The media's already circling like vultures, and the last thing we need is some officer running their mouth." I hesitated, my stomach knotting. In all my years here, I'd never been asked to sign an NDA for an inmate. It felt wrong, like stepping into something I wouldn't be able to walk back from. Still, I didn't argue. I signed the paper and handed it back. "Good," the warden said, flipping the folder shut. "Now remember, he's in solitary. No one goes in or out without clearance. Keep your distance, and don't, under any circumstances, listen to anything he says." The warning stayed with me as I walked back to my post. The warden's words weren't unusual, but his tone was. I'd seen him handle violent offenders, high-profile criminals, even people convicted of unthinkable crimes. None of them had ever rattled him like this. Diddy's arrival was unlike anything I'd experienced. He shuffled down the hallway between two guards, his hands cuffed in front of him. Even from a distance, I could see how tense he was, like every muscle in his body was coiled and ready to snap. The air seemed heavier as he passed, like the building itself was rejecting him. The officers led him to the solitary wing, where high-profile inmates and troublemakers were kept isolated, from the general population. I followed at a distance, watching as they stopped in front of a cell. Diddy stopped too. "No," he said, shaking his head. His voice was low but firm, like he was speaking to someone only he could see. "They're waiting for me." The officers exchanged glances, smirking. "Come on, superstar," one of them said. "Your suite's waiting." When Diddy didn't move, they shoved him inside. He stumbled but caught himself, his eyes fixed on the far corner of the cell. The door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing down the corridor. The officers locked it and walked away, laughing about how quickly celebrities fall apart. I didn't laugh. At first, Diddy didn't cause any trouble. He sat in the corner of his cell, his knees pulled to his chest, his head down. He barely moved, and when the meal trays came, he didn't touch them. But something wasn't right. Every time I walked past his cell, I felt it. The air was colder there, the shadows darker. At first, I chalked it up to my imagination. Then I started hearing the whispers. They weren't loud, just faint murmurs, impossible to make out. I told myself it was him talking to himself, but the rhythm was strange. He wasn't just muttering. It was like a conversation, back and forth. On my third night, it escalated. I was doing my rounds when I heard the banging. It was coming from Diddy's cell. I rushed over and found him huddled in the corner, his arms wrapped around his knees. His whole body was trembling, his eyes wide with terror. "They're here," he whispered. "They're coming for me. Please, don't let them take me." I shone my flashlight into the cell, scanning every corner. Nothing. Just shadows. "It's just your mind playing tricks," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You need to calm down." He didn't respond. He just kept pointing at the corner of the cell, his lips moving silently, like he was arguing with someone I couldn't see. Later that night, I watched the surveillance footage. I needed to know what he was seeing, but the screen showed nothing. Just him, sitting in the corner, staring at the empty air. As I locked up for the night, I thought I heard my name. It was faint, almost a whisper, coming from his cell. I told myself I was imagining things, but I didn't sleep well that night. Something shifted after that third night. Sean Diddy Combs, the man I had dismissed as just another inmate, was getting under my skin. I didn't want to admit it. I'd seen plenty of men break in solitary. Some screamed, some cried, some just sat in silence until their minds gave out. But this was different. It wasn't just the whispers or the way he stared into the shadows. It was the way the shadows seemed to stare back. I couldn't ignore it anymore. He was unraveling, but with Diddy, it wasn't just the isolation. It was something deeper, darker, like his body and soul were decaying from the inside out. His appearance changed first. The man who had walked into the Metropolitan Detention Center weeks earlier, frail but still recognizable, now looked like a shadow of himself. His weight was dropping alarmingly fast. The once broad-shouldered mogul now hunched over, his clothes hanging loose on his thinning frame. His skin had taken on a sallow, almost grayish hue, and his hair, once so meticulously maintained, was streaked with gray, sticking to his sweat-slicked forehead. The nurses said he refused to eat most of the time, leaving his meal trays untouched. When he did take a bite, it was almost mechanical, as if the act of eating disgusted him. His water cup sat on his tray, full and ignored. They found him collapsed in his cell once, severely dehydrated and weak, and had to administer fluids to stabilize him. "It's like he's giving up," one of the nurses said to me, her voice low, as if speaking too loudly might break him completely. But it wasn't just his physical decline that unnerved me. It was the things he said. One night during rounds, I stopped outside his cell. He was sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, staring into the corner as usual. But this time, he wasn't whispering. He was muttering louder, his voice carrying a strange rhythm, like he was reciting something. I couldn't make out the words at first, but then I heard fragments. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know they were so young. She begged me, but The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What did you say?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Diddy flinched, like he hadn't noticed me standing there. For a moment, his eyes flicked to mine, hollow and bloodshot. Then he looked away, his lips curling into a faint, bitter smile. "You wouldn't understand," he said, his voice hoarse. "You don't know what it's like, what I've done." "Then tell me," I said before I could stop myself. "What have you done?" At first, he didn't answer. He just stared into the corner, his body trembling slightly. Then, finally, he spoke. "They were just kids," he whispered. "I didn't touch them. Not like that. But I knew what was happening. I let it happen. I watched my stomach turned, and I took a step back." "You don't mean that," I said, my voice faltering. He laughed, a hollow, broken sound. "You think I'm lying? You think I'm some innocent victim?" He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. "I built my empire on this. The money, the power, the parties, it all came from them, from what I let happen to them." His words came in a torrent then, spilling out like a confession he'd been holding in for years. He spoke of the parties, the freak-offs, as he called them, where women, some barely legal, were paraded around like trophies. He described how drugs flowed freely, how people were coerced, how everything was recorded on tapes. I felt sick listening to him, but I couldn't look away. Erratic. He started talking more, but not to me or any of the officers. He was having conversations with someone or something I couldn't see. During rounds, I'd pause outside his cell to listen. At first, his words were soft, just above a whisper. "Please, I didn't mean to," he'd say, his voice trembling. Then he'd pause like he was listening to a reply. "No," he'd snap suddenly, his tone sharp and defensive. "You're lying, I didn't know." Another pause, longer this time, and then quieter, almost a whimper. "I'm sorry, just leave me alone." The pattern repeated over and over like a loop, his voice rising and falling as he argued with his invisible tormentor. I started lingering outside his cell longer than I should have, hoping to catch more of what he was saying. But the more I listened, the less I wanted to understand. It wasn't just Diddy. Something about the entire block felt wrong. The air was colder here, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and stays there. The fluorescent lights in the hallway flickered more often, casting brief flashes of shadow that seemed to stretch and move on their own. Other officers started to notice it too, though they didn't take it seriously. They joked about the Diddy curse, blaming every minor inconvenience on his presence. Lights flickering, doors jamming, radios cutting out. "Must be the ghost of Bad Boy Records," they'd say, laughing. But I wasn't laughing. Not anymore. One night, as I was walking past Diddy's cell, I heard him laugh. It wasn't a nervous laugh or the kind of laugh you'd expect from a man losing his mind. It was low and deliberate, like he was laughing at a private joke. I stopped in front of his cell and shone my flashlight inside. He was standing in the middle of the room, completely still. His face was turned toward me, but his eyes weren't looking at me. They were looking past me, like there was someone standing just behind my shoulder. "Something funny?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. His lips curled into a slow smile, the kind of smile that didn't belong on a man in his position. "You look beautiful tonight, King," he said. My stomach turned. There was something about the way he said it, the reverence in his tone. It felt wrong, deeply wrong, like he wasn't complimenting me, but praising me, worshiping me. I didn't respond. I turned and walked away, my pulse pounding in my ears, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me, even after I left. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying his words in my head. "You look beautiful tonight, King." The way he said it, it wasn't just unsettling. It felt personal, like he knew something about me that I didn't. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were restless. I dreamed of shadows, endless and suffocating, crawling up the walls of the prison. I saw eyes in the darkness, glowing and unblinking, and I heard whispers, soft, rasping voices that seemed to say my name. When I woke up, I couldn't move. My body was frozen, my chest rising and falling in shallow gasps as I stared into the dark corner of my room. It wasn't empty. The figure stood there, its outline barely visible in the faint light spilling through the blinds. Its face, or what I thought was a face, was made of shadows, except for two glowing eyes and a set of sharp, glinting teeth. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. I couldn't look away. It leaned forward, its voice low and rasping. "Hello, King." The sound vibrated in my skull, sending chills down my spine. The room felt colder, the air suffocating, and then it was gone, just like that. When I finally sat up, gasping for breath, the corner was empty. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't really left. I didn't go back to sleep. I spent the rest of the night sitting at my kitchen table, the overhead light on, clutching a cup of coffee. I couldn't bring myself to drink. The figure's voice echoed in my head. It wasn't just the words, "Hello, King," but the way it had said them, like it knew me, like it had been waiting for me. By the time my shift started, I was running on fumes. I didn't want to go back to 1600, but I couldn't call in sick. I told myself it was just a nightmare, my mind playing tricks on me. I told myself I was fine. I wasn't fine. Diddy wasn't in his cell when I arrived for my rounds. For a moment, I panicked. Had someone moved him without telling me? Had he hurt himself? Then I spotted him. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor, right in the middle of the hallway outside his cell. His hands rested on his knees, his head tilted upward. He looked peaceful. "Diddy?" I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "What are you doing out here?" He didn't respond. He looked worse than ever, gaunt, skeletal, his skin pale and stretched thin. "Diddy," I said, stepping closer. My voice was low, almost hesitant. He didn't move. For a moment, I thought he was asleep. Then his head rolled to the side, and his sunken eyes met mine. "They're coming," he whispered. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Who?" "The shadows," he said. His voice was weak, barely audible. "The demons. They feed on guilt and sin. They're here to collect what's owed." For a moment, I couldn't speak. "Demons?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. He nodded, his head jerking with the movement like it was too heavy for his neck to support. "I made deals, dark deals, horrible deals. Fame, power, everything I wanted, but it wasn't free. It was never free." The air in the cell felt colder, heavier. I shifted on my feet, suddenly aware of how close I was to the door. "What do you mean?" I asked. Diddy's lips curled into a faint, bitter smile. "They let me have it all, the money, the women, the life. But the cost was them. The freak-offs, the tapes, the people I destroyed, they were sacrifices. The king feeds on them." My stomach churned. "The king?" I asked. Diddy's eyes drifted to the corner of the cell, his gaze unfocused. "My demon, he's always been there, watching, waiting. And when the sacrifices stop..." He trailed off, his voice breaking. I didn't need him to finish the sentence. "When the sacrifices stop, he feeds on you," I said quietly. Diddy nodded, his bony fingers twitching against his knees. "I'm his now," he whispered. "Every second he tears me apart and puts me back together. Glorious pain, he calls it. Glorious." He laughed softly, a hollow, broken sound that sent chills down my spine. "The party never ends," he said. "It's purgatory, a never-ending freak-off, and I'm the main attraction." I looked around the cell, trying to see what he was staring at, but there was nothing there, just shadows and empty air. "You don't see him, do you?" Diddy asked, his voice sharp with bitter amusement. "No," I admitted. But you feel him, he said. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in the darkness behind him. You feel him, don't you? The air was heavy, pressing against my chest. My heart was racing, my palms damp with sweat. I didn't answer. Diddy's gaze drifted back to the corner. You should leave, he said softly. But it won't matter. Once you've seen him, he doesn't let you go. I stepped back, my hands shaking. You're just tired, I muttered, more to myself than to him. You're hallucinating. Diddy didn't respond. He just kept staring into the corner, his lips moving silently, like he was having another conversation with the thing I couldn't see. I turned and walked away, my pulse pounding in my ears. I returned to work for one final shift, determined to finish on my own terms. The building felt different that day. The air was heavier, the shadows darker, and every sound echoed like it was chasing me down the hall. When I passed Diddy's cell, I hesitated. I didn't want to stop. I didn't want to look, but something, curiosity, guilt, maybe fear, pulled me back. Diddy was lying on the floor, his body curled into a tight ball. His breathing was shallow, his skin pale and waxy. Diddy, I said, stepping closer to the cell. You okay? He didn't move. Diddy, I said again, louder this time. Slowly, he opened his eyes and looked at me. His gaze was empty, hollow, like he'd already left this world. Thank you, King, he whispered. The words sent a chill down my spine. I felt it again, that heavy, suffocating presence, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. He's here, he said. I turned to look, but the corner was empty. Diddy laughed softly. But he sees you. He sees the king in you. At that moment, I knew something is terribly wrong with Diddy, and I don't think he will recover. After my final shift at the Metropolitan Detention Center, I walked out of that building and swore I'd never set foot inside again. The shadows that clung to its walls, the cold, suffocating air of Diddy's block, it was too much. I thought I could leave it all behind. But the truth is, it never left me. It started with the whispers. I'd hear them at night, faint and distorted, as though coming from a distant room. They were impossible to make out, but they carried the same rhythm as Diddy's conversations with the shadows, soft murmurs, then silence like someone was responding. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the longer I ignored them, the louder they got. Soon, they weren't confined to the night. I heard them in the quiet moments during the day, when I was alone in the kitchen, or when the hum of the refrigerator faded just enough to leave room for their voices. You're losing it, I told myself. This is just residual stress. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Diddy wasn't the king. He wasn't the source of the darkness. He was a vessel, a pawn. The king wasn't just in Diddy's cell. It wasn't confined to MDC. It was something bigger, something darker, something that had its claws deep in the world Diddy came from. The music, the industry. Diddy wasn't just another inmate. He was part of something much larger, something that had used him and fed on him until there was nothing left. And the worst part, the king wasn't finished. I stood up, pacing the room, trying to make sense of it all. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just Diddy's story. It was a warning. The king was still out there, still feeding. And the shadows, they weren't just in the corners of cells, they were everywhere. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if the king will come for me. But I do know this. Once you've seen the king, you don't forget. To my listeners, if you're still here, I need you to listen closely. This isn't just a story. This is real. The shadows, the king, the darkness, it's all real. Diddy isn't the first, and he won't be the last. This thing, whatever it is, has its claws deep in places most of us will never see. And if it can reach someone like him, what's stopping it from reaching the rest of us? If you want to hear more true stories like this, Make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And remember, everyone has a story. The question is, who's next?